Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagement and wars. Having been thinking about this for a while, I've developed a little theory, right? That command is human and control, well, it's become increasingly technological. There are libraries filled with discussion and commentary about command, but very little about control. And given the growth in C2 systems in headquarters, I think we need to consider how we effectively synchronise between the two key functions of command and control. Do we even understand why we put control measures into the C2 taxonomy a few decades ago? My aim is to open the conversation up, since we haven't had a serious debate about what the control element of C2 is since the 1980s. I'm Peter Roberts, your host, as we talk to people, operators, commanders, technical geniuses, academics, and those from industry who've really been thinking about different aspects of C2 for a while. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic are the creators of Citaware, the world's #1 C4 ISR software. We've designed C2 systems for the military since 1986 and supply more than 45 countries worldwide. With a heritage built on innovative development and rigorous testing, this is a proven in-service solution based on real customer requirement and tailored to fit your needs.
This inaugural episode looks at the definitions, the evolution of command styles, and the addition of control into the C2 conundrum. I want to talk a bit about technology as part of the command functionality and about what this means for those slightly tired phrases perhaps of mission command and delegation. To do that, I'm delighted to be joined by Mick Ryan, a strategist and retired Major General from the Australian Army. He's a distinguished graduate of Johns Hopkins University of Advanced International Studies, as well as the USMC Command and Staff College and the USMC School of Advanced Warfare. He is completely a passionate advocate of professional education and lifelong learning. And in a 35-year military career, he commanded at multiple levels in the Australian Army and served in Iraq, Afghanistan and East Timor. Now, his first book, War Transformed, was published in 2022 and received accolades from around the world, and rightly so. Major General Mick Ryan, as he was in uniform, is one of those people that we've talked about for a few years now as being among the brightest and most interesting military minds in the world today. He's been a commander in his own right, as well as serving in HQs during his military career. Interestingly and usefully for us, Mick has also been able to spend some time over the past few months visiting the hotspots around the world, including Ukraine, so is well placed to recall his own experiences and to contrast those with more contemporary conflict on a great power scale. Mick, welcome to the show. Listen, what about this for a question? What is effective C2 and what does good look like?
Well, thanks for having me back again, and thanks for that very humbling introduction. Good C2, what does it look like? Well, firstly, it all depends on the context. You're looking at the tactical, the operational, strategic, or the national level, and C2 will be slightly different at each. And I do note command is different to control. In the broad, the way I think about this, command is about leaders, control is about staffs and feedback mechanisms. But I also think it's worth noting that any C2 approach has three key elements. The first element is the network. That's all the various elements that exist within a C2 framework, whether it's organisation, staffs, the physical or wireless wherewithal to connect them. So the network is part of it. The second part is the humans. A lot of nodes in a C2 framework are humans, whether they're individuals or staffs, whether they're commanders or followers. So that's an important component of C2 in any level that you look at. And then the third part is processes and doctrines. I mean, what are the methods, what are the processes that guide the application of command and control over the network by human beings? So whichever level you look at, you've got to consider those three elements. So any good C2 network will have thought through each of those elements and how they interact. And a successful one will balance provision of purpose, the provision of direction, which is different, the ability to generate feedback on that, both before and during the execution of it, and then the ability of that C2 network and the most senior commanders to adapt various elements of direction, purpose, based on the feedback. And ultimately, how do you know whether it's working or not? Well, you win. And if you lose, your approach to C2 is probably part of your problem.
There's a lot to unpack there, but I just want to go back to that start where you said C2's different for different contexts. Is it also different for different cultures? We think perhaps that the United States, the UK, Australia, for example, perhaps the Five Eyes community have a very similar view on C2. Do you think that's true, or do you think there are some differences that are based on our slightly different cultures, or is there a core element that's just absolutely giving us the same?
I think we all have similar doctrine and we train to similar approaches, but I actually think the execution in those three countries in particular is very different. If you have a look at the United States, for 100 years now, it's been used to being the big dog, the country at the top of the C2 tree, not just at the top, but pervasive throughout and providing a lot of the enablers. So I think its approach to command and control is driven by that strategic culture and that it has a global outlook. The UK has been the top dog, still has that mindset in some respects, and is used to strategizing, which I think is an important trait, and the provision of both purpose and tasks at national level on downwards. I think Australia is on a journey to there, but it's not there. Australia, I still think, lacks confidence in high-level strategy and command and control. It really has a historical background of taking direction from its senior security partner, not providing it. I don't think it's broken out of that yet. I think, and there's a lot of evidence of that, if you look at 2010, when the Dutch were handing over control of Uruzgan province, 2/3 of the soldiers in that province were Australian. The Australian government did not want to take leadership of it. Now, I think there's an ethically problematic approach there by the Australian government, but it does show a distinct lack of confidence by Australians in their ability to exercise these kind of things. I don't view that as having changed terribly much since then. So culture matters, history matters, and how you've worked together in the past matters.
And history is a big one, right? Because if you look at Germany, the invention of the staff system that came out of German reforms really shaped a lot of how professional Western armies grew and built their own structures in C2 terms, right? And the French had a very different way again, the Austrians slightly different. I mean, even in continental Europe, which you would have thought was a homogenous landmass, I mean, the peoples are so different. They had very different ways of executing C2. But the real contrast for me is that NATO states and partner sort of Western nations versus the Eastern, which in C2 terms was a very different paradigm, right?
Yeah, I think so. And we're seeing this play out now in Ukraine, right? We're seeing what I call the battle for the soul of the army, which is actually an ongoing thing in every army in peace and war. There's always a battle over what is the right idea to guide force structures and doctrines for a military. So what we're seeing in Ukraine is absolutely normal for a military institution. But we're seeing it play out writ large in this battle between the old Soviet era, more centralized versions of command and control, and more Western approaches to mission command. The Commander-in-Chief, General Valery Zaluzhny, is very aware of this, and he has spoken about it on multiple occasions. Indeed, he gave some very good interviews in the last month on this to a Ukrainian interviewer, and he talks about trying to root out these old Soviet approaches. He's of a generation whose formative experiences were in the East after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He studied NATO and Western military cultures and appears to be convinced that they are a better guiding light for his military than old Soviet doctrines. The challenge he has, of course, is that it's not easy to change these kind of doctrines overnight. As someone once said, the hardest thing to change in a military is an idea. And when you have decades of deep tradition, doctrine, and military culture guided by the Soviet experience, it will take time to shift the mindset in the Ukrainian military. That said, he's doing everything right. He's leading that transition. It will just be something that doesn't occur overnight.
And what about the Chinese? There's been lots of speculation about how the Chinese do command and control. Their leaders today still schooled in the old Soviet style. There's still quite a lot of central direction. There's a lack of delegation. And yet they followed the US arrangement in almost COCOM, certainly in area commands, when they broke up the military and sticking them in unified area commands. Do we know much about the way that the Chinese run C2?
I think we know a bit. The Chinese certainly have studied the Western way of war, particularly since the 1991 Gulf War. I mean, that was a transformative moment for them. They looked at what the US did and went, we are nothing like that. And they looked at it, as a positive trait in a military to be able to do that. So they began this 30-year journey of reform that they've been on. The problem that the Chinese have is that you can set up all the COCOMs you want, you can adopt joint doctrine, you can talk about systems destruction, warfare, but there's a massive gap between theory and practice, particularly when you don't believe in mission command. I mean, the Chinese will never be able to allow true mission command in their military because mission command doesn't just provide task and purpose, it allows subordinates to ask questions. And if you allow your military to ask questions in a highly centralised authoritarian system, which is only becoming more and more centralised, you don't want that kind of mindset pervading up the chain into politics. So they may have some systems and organisations that look Western, but their mindset is still very centralised. And I'll take you back just to the last couple of weeks in the Shangri-La dialogue where you had the Chinese defence minister exactly on message, not a hair's width out of the Chinese strategic messaging that's been going on for 10 years. So if a defence minister has zero latitude to go off message, how would we think that military commanders at any level, especially junior levels, would be able to exercise any initiative at all in peacetime and in war? So, I think we need to keep studying Chinese culture. We need to keep studying how they talk and then how they act. But I think there's a big gap between theory and practice in the PLA, and I think it's probably going to hurt them in the future.
It's interesting when we talk about centralisation because the Western experience, less in Iraq but more in Afghanistan, was the only place that had the ability to process the amount of information that was coming in, the only place that had the systems to do it, and introducing more and more C2 systems were higher level headquarters. And you felt that there was a pull and centralization of command and control into these high level headquarters, less delegation going out. It felt very Soviet in a way. And the reverse of that is really obvious in places like the IRGC, which is very Western in terms of delegation, down to the very lowest level, down to individuals, provided they follow the sort of guiding idea, and there's nothing more than that is sent out. They're given huge freedoms to act in a different way. Do you think there's a danger with the arrival of automated C2 systems and their lack of distribution further down the command chain, that we're going to see a sort of Western centralization of C2 capabilities and functionality at high level headquarters?
Possibly. Certainly that's what the Chinese want from their approach to AI and intelligentization. I think the reality is that we need to be careful not to fall in the Russian-Syrian trap. I mean, the Russians use Syria as a principal learning opportunity to guide doctrine and force structure, and that took them to Ukraine, and it has not worked out from them. And we need to be very careful not to fall in the same trap with our Afghanistan experience, because at the end of the day, Afghanistan was an extraordinarily slow-moving campaign. On a day-to-day basis, not a lot happened. It was a counterinsurgency campaign. What we're seeing in Ukraine is a tempo that is absolutely different from that in Afghanistan, and you can't use centralised approaches. Senior staffs could not keep up with the amount of data, the amount of activity, and the amount of decisions required in that environment. So the structure we used in Afghanistan is absolutely not fit for purpose in a Ukraine-type scenario. So C2 will have to adapt based on the pace of operations, the tempo of decision-making that's required, and how much the adversary is able to do things that surprise us, necessitating adaptation. So I would hope we're smarter than the Russians and that we don't base a lot of our future command and control on the lessons of Afghanistan.
It's interesting going back to Ukraine, though, isn't it? Because the one thing that really differed about Ukraine in C2 was their desire to be in almost constant connectivity with the front line, but the electronic environment and the jamming there, which prevented that. And in many cases, they were back to runners and motorcyclists and even cyclists taking paper messages back to higher headquarters where they were out of range of Russian jamming. I mean, that shifted a C2 paradigm completely again. You couldn't be centralized in that type of environment, right?
No, I think that's an excellent point, is there is no continuous connectivity in the modern battlefield. And that's actually a good thing. That forces commanders to prioritise and only communicate with their subordinates when they have to, and vice versa. Now, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be communicating. They should. They need an ongoing dialogue of direction and feedback. But at the end of the day, I think what we've seen from the Russians is electronic warfare that's not continuous, it's periodic, but it means you need to really think through how you talk, how you prioritise your interactions, and how much trust and delegation you push down. So I think there's some really interesting lessons there. The Russians in particular, after HIMARS, focused on C2 survivability, not just by pushing headquarters back, but dispersing them, hardening them, reducing their electronic emissions, laying field cables, like you said, using runners and motorcycles to carry messages. That is modern war. It's World War II war, but it's also modern war, is that if you aren't able to reduce your signature as a command and control hub, your survivability on the modern battlefield is very, very short. The detection to destruction time now is about a minute, if not shorter, if you're a high-value target. Not for everyone, but for high-value targets. And command and control hubs are the highest of value targets just because, one, it's good for morale to kill enemy generals, but two, it's excellent to be able to break down their cohesion, to put a fly in the ointment of any momentum they might be able to generate by destroying staff actions and staff physically. So, I think there's a huge amount of lessons from Ukraine, noting that it won't be the template for future war, but it offers insights into how we think about command and control in the future, including the training and preparation of commanders and staffs for future operations.
And that's sort of where I wanted to get to with the next bit, is based on what we've seen in recent Western experience, there seemed to be a massive growth in size of headquarters. And indeed, there was an old joke that was going around in London: in any problem, then you invent a new 2, 3 or 4-star headquarters to solve it. There was a proliferation of headquarters and staffs, more and more people being drawn out of the fighting arms in order to do C2. It became an industry in and of itself. Do you think that's going to change based on this experience? So we're going to see smaller headquarters. How are we going to do orchestration with the immense problems of logistics and firepower and divisional fires and support? How are we going to do all that stuff, but do it with a smaller footprint?
We will, because the dumb ones will all be dead. At the end of the day, the dummies who do this are going to die in future conflict. I mean, there's no other way to put this. I recall when I was a brigade commander, the first thing we started doing was measuring signatures and stripping out the size of the TAC and main and forward headquarters to make them smaller, more manoeuvrable, better connected. Whereas another brigade expanded its size and wasn't able to move and did 45-minute long commanders' prayers over the radio each afternoon. I looked at that and thought, you're dead. You just can't survive in the modern battle space doing those things. So we either anticipate this and adapt before we go into battle, or we will adapt because the dumb ones will die. I think the other part of this too is that at the strategic level, there has been a profusion of multi-star headquarters. And you might talk about this in the British context, but the one thing the Australian Defence Force has mastered in the last 20 years is setting up new 1 and 2 and 3-star headquarters, most of which have nothing to do with warfighting, which has, I think, changed the incentives for promotion. It's changed the incentives for behaviour. It's become very much a corporate, Canberra-centric culture of decision-making. But it's also incentivised collective decision making rather than command-led decision making. And I think that's extraordinarily dangerous, because if you're working in a fast-paced operational or tactical environment, you can't call a committee every time you need to make a decision. You can't sit around and chinwag with 20 other people to make decisions. You need people that can look at a situation, make a call and move on. And I think in the Australian context, and at the moment, we have a problem with that.
But you've seen lots of militaries, right? And you've got experience working in the US. You've seen various other NATO commanders operate. Is there a golden thread, a golden way that we can train commanders for the future that can drill into this stuff? But not just commanders, right? Their staff. And how do we mentor people and educate them in the right way to get to recapture some of this leadership, command stuff that perhaps is disappearing?
Yeah, I think, the US, the UK, Australia all have really good training and education systems. If there's better anywhere in the world, I'd love to hear about, because they have developed extraordinarily good training and education systems. The problem is, in some respects, they're too exquisite. They take so long now to build people that I wonder whether it's scalable if we have to mobilise. In fact, I don't know that it is. But it's more than just the training and education system. It's your promotion selection systems. It's your incentives for behaviour. And I think that's where the difference lies between the three countries. I think if you were to graph a scale of risk tolerance in those countries, I think US is probably on the right end. They probably tolerate greater risk. I think the UK is probably in the middle. Australia's down the left-hand side. We've become a very low-risk society, a very low-risk polity, and that flows from our politicians. The political class in Australia just takes zero risk. So that flows down into your military. So the training education, I think, is excellent, but it's the incentives and risk tolerance in society that is driving how military leaders are selected and perform at the moment.
Over the past few years, just reflecting on that, particularly with the politicians, over the last few years, we've seen a difficulty in getting politicians at the national security thing to exercise at that level, to practice some of this stuff, to think about those command things. They seem to want to revert to committee-style structures and sofas and have sidebar chats and, unminuted discussions. But isn't there something about actually not just thinking about our military commanders, but our political leaders too, and in some way training and giving them the skills and the confidence they need for some of this stuff? Ukraine's been really fortunate with Zelensky and the foreign minister and national security team in the political sense. I'm not sure that other states are as well served by that. How do we get politicians to engage in these discussions in a better way that equips them for the disasters to come?
Yeah, if you look at Ukraine, the holy trinity of Zelensky, Zaluzhny and Reznikov is one that has been very effective during this war and is a really good model of civ-mil interaction. Reznikov is not a former soldier. He's a lawyer, and same as Zelensky. So, I think there's a great model of civ-mil interaction, of what Elliot Cohen called the unequal dialogue there for us. If I was to look at Western politicians, it's a class now. Politicians kind of self-select from university days now and stay in that profession. And I don't know there's the diversity necessary in Western polities. But also, I think they're very narrow individuals. And I think the average talent in the political pool these days appears to be pretty low. And because of that, they don't like taking risks because they might not get voted back in. The only thing they seem to take risk in is their personal behaviour. But when it comes to making decisions, it's always collective, it's always recorded, and it really is 1% decisions which move the ball forward by very tiny increments in a world where things are moving in much, much larger increments. So no, we do have a problem in Western polities. I do think most political parties still have not adjusted to the information age. Certainly they use social media well, but I don't think they've adjusted yet to an environment where most citizens are better informed than what they were, say, a quarter of a century ago. And I think that's why you're seeing some of the problems we have in the US, UK and Australia are about hung parliaments and these kind of issues.
But you also have this feeling, perhaps, that Western politicians want to see a lot more information. They want some kind of certainty. This idea of having a common operating picture at the front line that is shared in real time back with state leaders and make state leaders feel they're empowered to make decisions or defer decisions based on watching real-time information with no experience is kind of dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, the quest for certainty is one of the enduring themes of command. Martin Creveld covers that specifically in his book, where he says, command has always been about the quest for certainty, and political leadership appears to be that now. And it's a shame because it shows a deep ignorance of human behaviour, and the reality is that there are no certainties around anything. I mean, I'm certain my wife and my daughters love me, but beyond that, it's very hard to get certainty in modern life because the world's moving quickly. There's so much information. There's so many differing views on things. So we need to ensure that our education programs, not just for military leaders, but political leaders, says, listen, you are never, ever going to get certainty. You are never going to have the satisfaction of knowing the exact outcome of a decision. So how do we incentivise the kind of behaviours that are necessary in that environment? How do we prepare people for that environment? And then how do we support them when they inevitably get something wrong? Because we're humans, right? We make mistakes, and we need to ensure, I guess, we define what's an acceptable mistake in that kind of era.
And that quest for certainty is brought to the fore where you have now electronic, sometimes automated systems, whether they're ML or data science or whatever you want to call them, AI in some circumstances, right, depending on how you define it, that provide data in front of the commander, in front of the staffs in a very compelling way that looks like absolute certainty, that looks like fact. And I guess commanders and staffs are becoming more used to seeing those systems present real hard data, what appears to be really hard data in a very compelling way that pushes towards a set of courses of action that feeds off what they want, which is this idea of predictability, of reinforcing their own beliefs, of seeing what they want to have happened. There's a danger there too, right, as well as this huge opportunity of having it.
Yeah, I mean, good commanders should be able to look at data and draw analytical conclusions and then decide and move on. And what we're seeing at the moment, particularly with this new era meshed civil-military sensor analysis and dissemination framework that's emerged largely out of Ukraine, but will continue afterwards, there is this quest for certainty. And whilst there is greater transparency because of a lot of the new era sensors, there's new kinds of uncertainties because how true is the data that the sensors are providing? How true are the networks that carry the information from those sensors to decision makers? They're sources of uncertainty. And in some respects, we need to prepare our people for the fallacy of certainty. There's no such thing. And whether it's introduced through data corruption or network spoofing or these kind of things, or just because we don't have sensors in an area where something important is going on, this fallacy of certainty is something that we really need to guard against and to intellectually prepare our people for.
So having moved on to, you dropped it there, how do we prepare our people really well to be a decent commander in the future? You've got a young commander, young sergeant who's just done his qualifying courses. He's just going out to his first real role in that rank. And he's thinking about down the line, I want to be really fit for task to command at a high level, battle group, brigade, div, whatever above that. He's looking to do that. What sort of steps do you give him to say, hey, if you want to be future fit, this is how you need to go about it?
The great thing is none of this is rocket science, right? A few of these ideas are new, and the way we encode it in our people is very, very simple in a systemic way. You provide them with the theory, including why you're providing them with the theory. You get them to practice it, and then you assess them, and then you repeat. I mean, that is how military education and training systems work. I think they're pretty effective generally, even though we may introduce new technologies and these kind of things, or residential, non-residential. It's still the same approach. What I think we're bad at is strategically deciding what is important in that system and what isn't. What are the topics that are important and what isn't? I think sometimes there's too much focus on strategic concerns around behaviour and stuff. Not saying it's not, but you need to be careful about balancing that with professional outcomes as well. So strategic leaders need to ensure there is a priority on technological literacy, on understanding the strengths and weaknesses of new era technologies, and then how are they blended with different ideas, different organisations, differing operating modalities to produce a military effective organisation. And at the end of the day, I like to always go back to Mick Ryan and Alan Millett's work on military effectiveness. How do you define tactical, operational, strategic and political effectiveness in war and peace? And how do you include effective command and control in each of those levels of military effectiveness?
C2 is evolving. I mean, since the 80s, it's become an industry. It really has become huge. You've only got to look at the definition. There's a number of headquarters that have C2 in their title somewhere, and it's quite shocking now. And it's evolving, right? And I get that. What ways do you think it's going to evolve in the future?
Well, I think it's going to have to evolve to be more disaggregated. I just don't think large organisations emitting significant signatures, be they visual, heat, electromagnetic, doesn't matter, or network congestion, I don't think they're survivable. So more disaggregation is going to be necessary, and that's going to require more trust and different ways of preparing our leaders and our staffs. But also not just disaggregation, but redundancy. You are going to lose C2 nodes. Look at COVID. We lost C2 nodes in COVID because people were sick. In wartime, you're going to lose them because the enemy's going to destroy them. And this dispersion, disaggregation is actually a long-term trend in ensuring survivability of military organisation. If you go back to Trevor Dupuis' work on the evolution of weapons and warfare, he graphs this over the period since the first industrial revolution, that the increased lethality of military organisations drove a consistent response, which was dispersion. And I think that's going to have to be a really significant part of our response. That is going to drive different warfighting concepts, as we've seen from the Marines already in the Pacific. It's going to drive different selection criteria for leaders who can work in more isolated and disconnected environments. It's going to drive different joint constructs because you need to be able to operate in all domains concurrently at pace. Unlike Afghanistan, we worked in one or two at a very slow pace. And then it's going to change how we train, educate, develop, mentor all our people.
But within that, concepts like mission command, for example, still retain their validity?
Absolutely. I think mission command, which is different at each level of experience, of course. I mean, for a very junior lieutenant, you don't give them too much mission command because you're mentoring them how to use it in the future whilst giving them pretty clear guidance. But, task and purpose, really important part of a mission. And if people understand the purpose, they can evolve their tasks and they can be more flexible, provided the other side of mission command, the feedback loops, are effective. And I think this is something I always focus on in mission command, is the feedback loops, because everyone wants to focus on, I want flexibility, but they don't focus on the feedback loops. And if you're given flexibility, but you're not providing feedback to your higher headquarters on how you're evolving your task or how you're doing business, mission command does not work. It's a two-way feedback loop. And we have to ensure that our people understand that. My experience is a lot of people just don't. They see the first bit about having flexibility, but the feedback and the continuous dialogue part is really underdone. And I know as a brigade commander, I really focused on this with my battalion commanders. Like, we got to be talking constantly, not just me to you, but you to me. And this feedback mechanism is not a discretionary part of mission command. It's essential and a core part of it.
Is that during planning and execution? So the 1/3, 2/3 thing, you've done your planning, you passed down your direction, and you expect that feedback during the planning as well as execution, right?
I always worked on three parts: design, planning, execution. So design was commanders talking about future. So for me, it was, as a brigade commander, I was talking to my 7 battalion commanders and just shooting the breeze. Out of that would come my rough design and direction to planners. And then I would be part of that process, particularly coming up with mission analysis and options development. And then execution was once again a back and forth process between me and staff, me and commanders and staff. So that interaction is vital at each of those three steps. And frankly, sometimes you're doing all three at once, which can be an interesting juggling act. But once again, this gets down to commanders prioritising their time and trusting their subordinates to get on with the job while they're going through a design or planning process for the next phase or the phase after that.
So we've talked about the military, we've talked a little bit about politicians, we've talked about the systems. There's a big part of the sort of national security community, which is industry as well, right? So does industry have a role in this? How do they play a part? Should they play a part?
I think they're an integral part of this. And the roles they play are about showing us new opportunities with different technologies and capabilities, but also informing us about development timelines, about stock holdings, about costs. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're not talking costs of capability, you're not really talking strategy. So industry are an important part of that. And I think it has to be a continuous dialogue. At the other end of that dialogue is government and militaries telegraphing to industry the kind of capabilities they think might be useful in 5 or 10 years' time as well. And a lot of industry isn't able to go out and invest without these kind of demand signals from military institutions. So, there's a two-way responsibility here. It isn't just about industry's responsibilities. There's government and military responsibilities to industry. I think it's an equal dialogue, not an unequal dialogue, but it's an important part of any national approach to sovereign capability and, frankly, national resilience.
And that brings us right back round to the start with context and culture. Mick, listen, thanks so much for sparing the time. It's always a huge pleasure to talk to you. I'm glad we managed to find a suitable time for you that wasn't a ridiculous moment in the middle of the night in Brisbane. Really appreciate it.
No, thanks. It's been great to talk to you again.
If you enjoyed listening to Mick, then you can find him on Twitter or Substack or through his website, which is mickryan.com.au. You can also buy his books. The most recent fiction work he's written is called White Sun War. It's a novel about a future war between China and the United States over Taiwan. Thoroughly recommended.
Systematic. Join your partners and allies already using our cutting-edge C4 ISR Citaware suite.
We hope you enjoyed the show, as well as telling your friends and colleagues about it. Please do subscribe. Leave us a review on any of the usual podcast streaming platforms. This really helps us to reach new audiences and spread the word. And if you have a question or want to meet in person, we're going to be recording an episode live at DSCI in London on Tuesday the 12th of September. Send us questions in advance via email or Twitter, where you can find us at Tango Mike Whiskey Podcast, TMW Podcast. This episode is produced by Radius Lab as a show for the Wavell Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.